A 2-year-old girl spent 2 days alone in a house with her dead mother. She didn't know what death was. She just knew something was wrong, and she tried to fix it the only way a toddler knows how. She brought tissues. She pressed them against wounds that would never stop being wounds. She carried empty baby bottles down a hallway that still had blood on the walls, offering them to a woman who could no longer take them. That is where this story starts. Not with the killer, not with the arrest, with a little girl, alone, doing the only thing she could think to do. It would take 29 years, a DNA lab that gave up, and one volunteer who refused to, before anyone finally said his name out loud in a courtroom. If that opening made your stomach turn, good. Keep it there. Because everything you're about to hear actually happened, and the way it finally got solved is stranger and darker, and more remarkable than almost anything true crime has produced in the last decade. This is a true story, reconstructed from court records, police statements, and interviews given by the family. Some details have been arranged for narrative flow. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This case involves a violent home invasion, graphic injury, and a child left alone with a homicide victim. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of case. The ones where the science says impossible and somebody refuses to believe it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand how a woman was murdered in her own bedroom while her husband was 4,000 miles away with an unbreakable alibi. Why a professional DNA laboratory told police this case had a solvability rate of effectively 0. How a hobbyist genealogist spent 3.5 years chasing 1,500 distant cousins with no pay and no guarantee of success. And how a 5-minute conversation on a quiet driveway in upstate New York ended with a man confessing to being, in his own words, a serial killer who only killed once. Stay until the end, because the detail that finally broke this case wasn't the DNA at all. It was a stain the size of a coin that almost got missed completely. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the murder, the woman. Before you can understand what was taken on the night of November 18th, 1994, you have to understand who Robin Lawrence actually was, because that's what makes what happened to her feel less like a case file and more like a wound that never closed. She was born in Memphis, Tennessee, the daughter of a World War II veteran named Robert and his wife Jessie. She grew up in the final years of Jim Crow, a childhood where her own parents weren't permitted to sit in the front of a bus, weren't allowed inside the city zoo except on the days somebody else decided they could be. She watched her parents live inside those limits without ever once losing themselves. And she took everything she absorbed from that, the injustice, the resilience, the quiet dignity underneath both, and she turned it into art. She earned a fine arts degree from Carnegie Mellon, one of the most demanding programs in the country. And what she produced afterward wasn't the slow build most artists spend a lifetime working toward. She was chosen to sculpt the very first medal for the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, a medal awarded to Rosa Parks. Her father, a man who had spent years fighting for a country that hadn't fully fought for him, stood and watched his daughter's hands shape that medal into existence. Her sister Mary would later say it plainly, that was a big deal. People who knew Robin describe her the same way, almost word for word, like there was no other way to describe her. Warm, funny, present in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Her friend Lori, who met her in a ballet class years earlier, said Robin was beautiful, not only physically, but in the quality of attention she gave to everyone around her. Personable, fun-loving, down-to-earth. She met Ollie Lawrence in the late 1980s. He was calm, steady, the kind of man who made the people around him relax without trying. They married on New Year's Eve, 1989. 3 years later, their daughter Nicole was born. By 1994, they had built exactly the kind of life people spend decades working toward. Robin was in advertising. Ollie was an airline executive. They were slowly fixing up a house on a quiet cul-de-sac in West Springfield, Virginia, the kind of neighborhood built on the promise that nothing bad happens here. Nicole had recently gone through a liver transplant and depended on daily immunosuppressive medication to stay alive. Medication with a schedule so strict it could not slip by even a single day. Robin understood that schedule the way only a mother watching over a fragile child can understand it, completely, instinctively, without needing to be reminded. Here is the detail that makes what happened next almost impossible to process. Nobody who knew Robin Lawrence could name a single enemy. Not one grudge. Not one relationship carrying even a hint of danger. She wasn't a woman anyone had reason to fear for. And that is exactly what makes November 18th, 1994 so disturbing, because whatever came through that window that night had absolutely nothing to do with who Robin was, and everything to do with something far colder and far more random than anyone wanted to accept. Ollie flew out that Friday for a business trip to the Bahamas. Robin stayed home with Nicole. Investigators would later establish that the last confirmed contact with Robin was around 6 o'clock that evening, somewhere around 9:30 that night. And this is the moment everything changes. Someone approached the back of the house on Reca Lane. They found the screen on the deck window. They cut it open. They put on a ski mask. They pulled on leather gloves. Think about what that means for a second. A ski mask and gloves aren't things you grab in a moment of impulse. That's preparation. That's a decision made before he ever left his own house that night. He climbed through the window. He moved down the hallway, past the room where a 2-year-old girl was sleeping, toward the master bedroom where Robin lay alone. What happened next lasted long enough to leave 49 stab wounds across Robin Lawrence's body. Sit with that number for a moment, because it tells you something the crime scene photographs never had to say out loud. This wasn't quick. This wasn't panic. Wounds on her hands, where she raised them to defend herself. Wounds across her back and her legs, meaning she had turned, meaning she had tried to run. A severe wound to her neck. The phone cord in the bedroom had already been cut, severed before she ever had the chance to reach for it, which means he thought about that too, before he ever climbed through that window. She fought. She fought her way out of the bed. She fought across the room. She did not go quietly, and whoever did this to her had to work for every single one of those 49 wounds. And then, when it was finally over, he did something that should chill you more than the attack itself. He walked to the bathroom. He cleaned himself up. He climbed back out through the same window he'd come in. He got in his car. He drove home. Nicole was 2 years old, and Nicole was alone. She had been alone with her mother's body since the moment it happened. A toddler wandering through the rooms of her own house, understanding only what a 2-year-old can understand about blood and stillness, and something being deeply, terribly wrong. She pressed tissues against wounds that had already stopped needing anything. She carried empty baby bottles down the hall and offered them, again and again, to a mother who could no longer answer. She was in that house for 2 days. But that's not even the worst part of what almost happened. Because if one particular phone call had gone even slightly differently, if one friend had waited just one more day to check in, nobody knows how much longer that little girl would have stayed in that house alone. By Sunday, November 20th, Ollie still hadn't been able to reach Robin. 2 days of silence from a woman who never went silent. He called a close friend, Lori Lindbergh, and asked her, almost casually, if she'd mind swinging by the house to check. She drove over. She knocked. No answer. She walked around to the back deck, and that's when she saw it. The cut window screen, hanging open exactly the way the killer had left it 2 nights earlier. She climbed through the same window he had used to get in. And then Nicole came walking down the hallway toward her. Eyes wide open. No expression on her face at all. The kind of blank, flat stillness that, in hindsight, tells you a 2-year-old's mind had already found a way to survive something no child should ever have to survive. Lori moved toward the master bedroom. She didn't even need to walk inside. She could see the walls from the hallway. She called 911. She scooped Nicole up and rushed her to the hospital. The little girl had gone 2 full days without the medication that was keeping her alive, and every hour mattered now in a completely different, equally terrifying way. Lead Detective Mark Garman arrived to a scene that told a story all on its own. The cut screen, the trail through the house, the bedroom, the blood on the walls that traced exactly how long and how hard Robin had fought. No jewelry missing, no cash taken. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely, something concentrated, prolonged, and disturbingly personal. Investigators did what investigators always do first. They looked at the husband. And here's where the case takes its first genuinely dark turn, because what they found made Ollie Lawrence look, on paper, exactly like a man with a motive. He'd been having an affair with a colleague, a fact that came out almost immediately once detectives started digging into the marriage. And the timing was impossible to ignore. The one weekend his wife was murdered happened to be the exact weekend he was conveniently out of the country. Detectives flew to the Bahamas themselves to check every hour of his story. And every single hour held up. The correct flight. The correct hotel. Witnesses who placed him exactly where he said he'd been. The entire night his wife was dying 4,000 miles away. Ollie was cleared. And with him gone as a suspect, the investigation had almost nothing left to hold on to. Almost. Because in the bathroom, the same bathroom where the killer had calmly washed himself off before climbing back out that window, Detective Garman noticed something small. A washcloth, hanging on the towel rod beside the sliding tub door. On it, a faint brownish stain. The kind of thing that's easy to glance past. The kind of thing 99 detectives out of 100 might not have bothered to photograph. Garman photographed it anyway. He had it tested. It was blood, and it didn't belong to Robin or to anyone in that household. The theory formed almost instantly. The killer had cut himself somewhere during the attack, and in the calm, cold minutes afterward, cleaned himself up without realizing he'd left a piece of himself behind. That DNA profile went straight into Cody's, the FBI's National Criminal Database. No match. The case went cold, and it would stay that way for 29 years. Before we go further into how this case finally cracked open, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And go ahead and join our community by clicking the link in the description box, because we cover cases exactly like this one, the ones science almost couldn't solve, every single week. Now, here's where decades pass, where a family quietly breaks in slow motion, and where one woman with no badge and no salary decides to do something nobody was paying her to do. Years passed, then decades. Robin's mother, Jessie, died without ever learning who had murdered her daughter. Her father, Robert Sr., a World War II veteran who had already survived things most of us can't imagine, carried that same unanswered question with him across an entire century of living. He would still be alive, still waiting, when the answer finally came. Nicole grew up without a mother. Her cousin Lauren stayed close to her through all of it, but the two of them almost never spoke about what happened. "I didn't want to make her anxious," Lauren said. "It felt easier, safer, to leave it unsaid." Robin's sister Mary eventually reached a point where she told herself she had to let it go, not because she'd stopped caring, but because carrying an unanswered question for that long eventually starts to feel like the only way to survive it. "When my mother died," Mary said, she went to her grave not knowing what happened to her child. But inside the Fairfax County Police Department, the file never actually closed. It just went quiet. In April of 2021, cold case detectives Melissa Wallace and John Long were assigned to review it fresh. They pulled the original crime scene photographs. They read every report from 1994, line by line. "That's like your worst nightmare," Wallace said, looking at the bedroom photos for the first time. Long described the violence in a single word: brutal. And there it was, still sitting in an evidence file, still preserved after all those years, the washcloth DNA. A piece of the killer himself, waiting patiently for someone to finally have somewhere to send it. It just had nowhere to go, Wallace said. 2 years before Wallace and Long officially reopened the case, Fairfax County had already made one attempt to change that. In 2019, they turned to Parabon Nanolabs, one of the most respected forensic genetic genealogy companies in the country, a company that had already helped crack cold cases across the entire DC region. Parabon's director of bioinformatics, Ellen Gradick, ran the washcloth DNA through 2 massive consumer ancestry databases, the same kind of databases ordinary people use to find out where their great-grandparents came from. What came back should have been good news. Instead, it was almost worse than nothing at all. The matches were staggeringly distant. 4th cousins, 6th cousins, relationships so far removed that the shared ancestor connecting them to the unknown killer might have been alive 8 or 10 generations earlier. And each one of those distant cousins had hundreds of living descendants scattered across the world today. This wasn't a needle in a haystack. This was a needle hidden inside a field made entirely of haystacks, and nobody had a map. Parabon gave Fairfax County the only honest answer they could give. Solvability, effectively 0. Not low, not difficult, 0. They simply did not have the time, or the staff, or the resources to untangle a single suspect out of a genealogical web spread that thin. They did manage to extract one more piece, though, a rough genetic sketch. The DNA suggested the killer likely carried around half Eastern European ancestry, roughly a quarter Irish, with the rest split between English, Italian, and Scandinavian. Parabon used that breakdown to build something called a phenotyping composite, a predicted face generated entirely from DNA. Fair skin, a wider jaw, a narrower nose, dark blue eyes, light brown hair. They aged the model to roughly 25 years old and handed it over. Detective Wallace showed that composite to Ollie Lawrence over a video call, hoping something, anything, would spark. It sparked nothing. A DNA profile, a predicted face, a solvability rating of 0, and no path forward at all. That's the moment a volunteer raised her hand. Her name was Liz. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't a forensic scientist. She was a hobbyist, someone who spent her free time doing the slow, patient, almost obsessive work of tracing family trees, purely because she found it fascinating. The kind of work most people would call unbearably tedious. She happened to have exactly the right temperament for it. I just felt I wanted to give something back to the community, she told investigators. And I believed that I could actually be helpful in solving some of these cases. They handed her everything. The ethnicity breakdown, the list of distant cousin matches, the composite sketch nobody had recognized. They told her, honestly, what Parabon had already concluded. She said she'd try anyway. What she was actually staring down was almost 1,500 distant cousins. No first cousins, no second cousins, mostly fourth to sixth relations, each one connected to the unknown killer through a common ancestor buried somewhere between 4 and 6 generations back. For every single one of those 1,500 names, she would need to build an entire family tree stretching backward to find that shared ancestor, and then trace every single branch of that tree forward again, generation by generation, all the way to the present day. I was not certain that I could crack it, she said. She started with the strongest matches, the cousins who shared the largest fragments of DNA, even if those fragments were still tiny. She traced their lines backward through the decades, cross-checking every branch against the ethnicity markers Parabon had already identified. Some lines pointed toward Eastern Europe, some toward Ireland. Some simply stopped, generations back, because the records that would have continued them had never survived at all. She hit walls constantly, dead ends that had taken weeks to reach, collapsing in a single afternoon. I was ready to give up a number of times, she said. But every time she got there, she told herself the same small, quiet thing. Just finish this one branch. Just do one more thing. One more thing became 2. 2 became a week. A week became a month. A month became a year. And then another year. And then another. 3.5 years after she first opened that file, something finally happened that changed everything. Liz had identified 2 separate cousin matches, 2 people with no traceable connection to each other through any line she could find, which meant their genetic link to the unknown killer had to be running through 2 completely different branches of the same distant family. And if she could find the single exact point where those 2 branches crossed, the one couple where someone from one tree had married someone from the other, the unknown suspect would have to be a direct descendant of that couple. She kept tracing. She followed both lines deep into records from Canada, where several of the ancestors had settled generations earlier. And then she found it. This woman on this tree married this man on this tree, she said. That was it. That was the aha moment. That was when I realized, he is a descendant of this couple, right here. In that instant, 1,500 possible names collapsed down into the descendants of a single couple. One of those descendants was a man named Stephen Smirk. Detective Wallace pulled everything she could find on him. Computer programmer. Living in Niskayuna, New York, a quiet, comfortable suburb upstate. Married. 2 kids in high school. A nice house. And not so much as a single speeding ticket across his entire adult life. There's no way this is our guy, Wallace remembers thinking. Then Long pulled up an old yearbook photo. Smirk at 16 years old, back in 1988. They held it beside the Parabon composite, the predicted face generated entirely from a bloodstain on a washcloth 29 years earlier. The jaw, the nose, the shape of the eyes. It matched. We're like, well, you know, Long said. Maybe this does make sense. They dug into his history, and piece by piece, everything that shouldn't have fit suddenly did. In November of 1994, Smirk had been 22 years old, an active duty soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, barely 20 minutes from the house on Reca Lane. He had no criminal record at all. Nothing. He fit the timeline. He fit the geography. He fit the face. On September 7th, 2023, Wallace and Long made the 400-mile drive north to Niskayuna, New York. When they pulled up to Smirk's house, he was standing in his own driveway, taking out the trash. An ordinary Thursday. An ordinary man doing an ordinary chore. They identified themselves as cold case detectives from Fairfax County, Virginia. They told him they were looking into an old case from the 1990s. They asked if he'd be willing to talk. He said yes. He invited them inside his home. The conversation lasted 5 minutes. They asked him for a DNA swab, purely as a formality. He signed the consent form without hesitating. No questions. Nothing. No surprise. No fear. Nothing. Read that again, because that single detail is one of the most unsettling things in this entire case. A man is approached out of nowhere by detectives from a state 400 miles away, asking about a murder from 29 years earlier, and he shows no reaction at all. Not confusion. Not fear. Nothing. They packaged the swab. They left a business card. They drove to their hotel expecting a long wait. DNA results typically take weeks. They wouldn't need to wait that long at all. But that's not even the worst part. Detective Wallace's phone rang. It was Smirk. He told her he was standing inside the Niskayuna Police Department. He said he was there to turn himself in, that the station happened to be locked at that hour, and he was having trouble getting anyone to come let him inside.
Around 5 o'clock, my cell phone rings, and I see it's Mr. Smirk. He said, "Where are you?" And that made me a little uneasy. And I said, "I'm at the hotel. What can I do for you?" And he says, "I'm at the Niskayuna police station to turn myself in." And I said, "Turn yourself in for what?" And he says, "I'm here to turn myself in for the murder." Time, 6:13 p.m. and we're at the Niskayuna Police Department. He's just sitting there, very calm, same demeanor, jeans and a t-shirt, very normal.
Where do you want to start?
Well, you understand, right? You're in custody, right?
But
So you're not free to go at this point.
I don't have any intention of seeing the free world in a while, if at all.
Do you remember anything about the
She
person's
was
death?
African American.
Okay,
That's all I remember.
okay. I'm thinking, okay, that's good. But, I need more. And then he starts walking through that he was stationed at Fort Myer in the Army.
I was actually at the barracks, been drinking for a while that day. I think it was like a Friday. And something inside me said that, it's hard to explain. I knew that I was going to kill somebody.
And can you describe anything about the location of where it
It
happened?
was a residence. My friends were staying at the house next door. That's how I knew of the area. I never met this person before or seen her or anything. I gained access through the back sliding door. And I went in and noticed that she had a daughter, a baby in one of the rooms.
That's when I knew we were talking about the same case, because of Nicole being there.
Smirk continues on, telling the detectives he entered Robin Lawrence's bedroom.
I startled her. She got out of bed. She was on her knees. She did reach for the phone, and I instantly went and cut the line. Cut her up very good.
Do you remember where on her body you would cut her?
I did everything they taught me in the military, hand-to-hand combat. I stabbed her in the back of the neck. I think it was on the right side because I was behind her, and I had her by her hair. And cut out her throat with the knife.
I'm thinking, my God, I can't believe I'm getting this confession right now. I can't believe he's done this. I can't believe there's no emotion. It's almost like he was just resigned to the fact of like, it's over. Let me just get this interview over with and out of the way and let me move on. Did you injure yourself at all during this? Did you cut yourself?
Not that I can remember. I know she clawed at my face.
Did you ever go into her bathroom at all? Do you remember?
I don't remember that. If I did go into the bathroom, it would have been to look at what she did to my face, because I do remember looking at that in the mirror in my truck.
I felt like it was sincere. I was surprised he didn't remember more details, and then that made me realize that to him this was just another day.
What did you use to kill her?
I used a cold steel Tonto knife. I remember driving over a bridge and just tossing it out the window in a body of water. I went back to the barracks, washed up, got new clothes, put everything in a garbage bag, and dumped the garbage bag in the barracks trash can.
There was no emotion, there was no remorse. It was like he was telling me a story in the same way that he would be telling me about his golf game the day before.
After you killed Robin, did it seem to satisfy that need, that urge?
At the time, yes.
And then how long until you started feeling it again?
I'm going to say something and you can believe it however you want to believe it. I could be a serial killer.
Sit with that for a moment. Let it actually land. A man who spent 29 years coaching his daughter's school projects, paying his taxes, telling 2 detectives, without being asked, that the only thing standing between him and being a serial killer was the family he happened to build afterward. A week later, forensic testing confirmed it beyond any argument. Smirk's DNA matched the blood on that washcloth. The probability that it belonged to anyone else on Earth, 1 in more than 7 million. 3.5 years of One More Thing had just closed a 29-year-old murder. Stephen Smirk was born in 1971. In November of 1994, he was 22, stationed at Fort Myer, directly across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. He was honorably discharged from the Army sometime after his service. He became a computer programmer. He married a defense attorney named Dawn. They had 2 children. They built a life in Niskayuna that looked, from every visible angle, completely unremarkable. He paid his taxes. He committed no other documented crime in 29 years. For nearly 3 decades, absolutely nothing in his outward life gave any indication of what he had done on one night in 1994. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, who later reviewed the case, offered a line that should sit uncomfortably with anyone watching this. A clean record, she said, means nothing in isolation. The absence of an arrest doesn't mean the absence of violence. It just means he never got caught for it. O'Toole also pushed back hard on the idea that this crime had been some kind of random opportunistic act. He brought a weapon. He wore a mask. He wore gloves. He chose a night his target's husband was confirmed to be out of the country. This was purposeful, she said. At sentencing, Smirk's own defense attorney, his wife, told the court that in 1994 he had been a troubled young man with undiagnosed bipolar disorder, struggling with alcohol and substance abuse. She said he'd spent decades getting sober, building a stable life, and that his confession had come from genuine remorse. His interrogation tape told a different story. No remorse. No hesitation. I think what you see is 100% what you get from him, Wallace said. Arrogance. Entitlement. He wanted to do it, so he did it. And that's it. Robin's family wanted a trial. They wanted the world to hear every detail out loud, in open court. We wanted the world to know what he did, Mary said. We wanted the spectacle of that satisfaction. In October of 2024, Smirk accepted a plea deal for first-degree murder instead. The Commonwealth's attorney explained the reasoning. A plea guaranteed accountability without the risk that 30-year-old memories, tested under cross-examination, might crack in ways that let him walk free. On March 7, 2025, a judge handed down the maximum sentence allowed under that plea. 70 years, with the possibility of parole. The judge called it one of the worst murders in the history of Fairfax County. Smirk spoke to Robin's family directly for the first time in that courtroom. No family should have to wait 30 years for justice for a loved one, he said. I am extremely sorry for the pain and suffering I have caused. Robin's brother, Robert Jr., stood and addressed the court. The impact of this crime has been devastating beyond measure. No family should endure such prolonged suffering. Outside the courthouse, Ollie Lawrence gave a short statement. The family, he said, was grateful that justice had finally been done for Robin. And Nicole, the 2-year-old girl who had once pressed tissues to wounds she didn't understand, who had carried empty bottles down a bloodied hallway looking for a mother who could no longer answer, stood beside her cousin Lauren as reporters gathered. As much as it's a sigh of relief, Lauren said, her voice breaking on camera, "We still have to live with this. It just doesn't go away." She looked over at Nicole. "She's strong," Lauren said. "She stood next to me and she held my hand." And then, quietly, almost to herself, "Oh my God, if her mom could see us." When Lauren was asked how she wanted the world to remember her aunt, she didn't hesitate. Creative, exuberant, very vocal, caring, a beautiful mother. Her art still exists. The medal she sculpted for Rosa Parks still exists, sitting somewhere in the world as proof of exactly who Robin Lawrence was before any of this happened to her. What Stefan Smirk actually took, from Nicole, from Robert Sr., from Jesse, who died never knowing his name, is the one thing that can never, under any circumstance, be given back. A professional DNA laboratory looked at this case and told investigators, in plain language, that it was effectively unsolvable. 0. Not difficult. Not a long shot. 0. A volunteer with no badge, no paycheck, and no guarantee of success looked at the exact same impossible math and said she'd try anyway. She spent 3.5 years quietly tracing 1,500 branches of strangers' family trees in her spare time, hitting dead end after dead end, telling herself the same small lie every single time she wanted to quit. Just one more thing. That one more thing is the only reason Robin Lawrence's name is attached to a conviction today, instead of sitting in a drawer that only gets opened once a decade. But here's the detail worth sitting with as this video ends, because none of it, not the 1,500 cousins, not the 3.5 years, not the genealogy that didn't even exist as a technology back in 1994, none of it would have mattered without one earlier decision, made by one detective, in a bathroom, in November of that same year. A small brownish stain on a washcloth, easy to miss, easy to walk right past. He photographed it anyway. If he hadn't, there would have been nothing for Liz to trace at all. No cousins, no family tree, no driveway conversation in upstate New York. Just a name that never gets said out loud in a courtroom, and a family that carries the not knowing all the way to their own graves, the way Robin's mother did. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. Which single moment actually solved this case? The 5 seconds it took a detective to lift a camera to a stain nobody else would have looked at twice in 1994? Or the 3.5 years it took a volunteer, working for free, refusing to stop doing one more thing? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Hit like on this video if this case affected you the way it affected us, and subscribe if you're new. We cover exactly these kinds of cases, the ones where science says impossible and somebody refuses to accept it, every single week. Click the link in the description box to join our community and talk about cases like this one before anyone else does. Somewhere right now, there is another washcloth. Another stain nobody's looked at twice yet. Another file marked unsolvable, sitting in a drawer, waiting for one person willing to do one more thing. This has been Case Filed. We'll see you in the next one.